We're back. Welcome to the Think Bunker. This is the next brief in our series of briefs where we go over topics of military history and and whatnot. As you can see, the we'll be going over the history of the fighter aircraft. With that out of the way, before we begin, if you watch this channel on a regular, statistically very few of you do, but regardless, we are thankful of those that do, and we are eternally grateful. If you are new to the channel, this is not the only kind of content we produce. We also produce animated stuff. You just look through our channel history. We'll do music videos every once in a while. We'll do a animated video. We just did one recently on what the classifications of tank are and their subclasses. So go check that out. Regardless, let us begin the history of the fighter aircraft. So, fighter aircraft begin with biplanes. And the reason why biplanes themselves were chosen specifically to be in the configuration that they ended up being in was because kind of because of the Wright brothers, but mostly because of engine power or lack thereof. The science behind aircraft and aeronautics is that if you have something flying or moving forward at enough speed, and then you have a wide enough wingspan, that could generate lift. And of course, there's also things to do with the shape of the wing themselves as well. But creating lift will allow you to lift off the ground, but you have to have strong enough propulsion. This is why the Wright brothers were weren't able to just continuously fly till they cut their engines. They only extended their glide until their engines, or rather until they ran out of momentum. There's also the issue of lift as you also have the issue of early engines were not powerful and therefore could not drag you along at a high enough speed to where with a monoplane design at this time you could have adequate lift and also maneuvering capabilities. So that's where biplanes came into effect, where you if you put if as they did put a second set of wings on there, this would double your, or not so much double, but it would drastically increase your lift force, thus allowing you to take off faster, gain altitude faster, recover from a dip in altitude faster. And with that in mind, that's why biplanes were the way they were. And in exchange for the engines of this time, which were not even really in comparison to, especially in comparison to the next five or so, 5, 10, 20 years, the engines would these engines are far, they leave much to be desired, a lot to be desired, and
Well,
as a result, um where was I going with that?
the
It was
major problem with engines around the time is engines are pretty new, just as a whole,
mhm,
and most of the other engines are, frankly speaking, way too heavy to be practical to generate enough RPM to
mhm.
move a propeller at a speed that is conducive to generating lift. The one of the more practical uses for engines around this time is stuff like tractors and early cars, but then again, these cars and tractors were not speed demons. They were prioritizing torque with the motors, and to be put a little bit bluntly, they were not um, compatible with the high speeds that were necessary. Also, having many technical issues with them during their early development. However, by the 1900, they had accumulated enough knowledge on making lighter weight engines to where manufacturing aircraft became more of a accepted reality. Um,
Pro- Sorry, Kento, finish your point.
so, with a lot of early aircraft, simply put, the engines could never hope of generating anywhere near the amount of uh, energy that would be required without either destroying the engines or the engine being far heavier than what a plane could support. Um, Sort of like the circular thing of you need a stronger engine, so make the engine bigger, meaning that you need a bigger and you need more power, which means you need a bigger engine. It's a circular defeating logic. There were a couple of planes where people tried to put basically car motors. I mean, into planes or like tractor motors and putting them into planes to mixed results. The Wright brothers aircraft, most of its speed came from the ramp that they used to launch the aircraft and assisted by the motors, and the motors would keep it in the air, but fundamentally it was a glide aircraft.
Right, and that's why though without those motors, the aircraft, the contraption would have landed far sooner than it did, but the motors only prolonged its flight.
Yes, they did have a non powered glider. The Wright brothers anyway had a non powered glider, and it the powered glider performed way better, but it still was not traveling more than a couple hundred feet um, off the runway. I think.
Yeah. All in all, this would culminate in these designs where this was the balance. It was a balance of the best. I mean, this was pretty much the only feasible option at this time as far as the configuration goes, because they're limited solely by their power plant in that their power to weight ratio is awful in comparison to what would come after. Regardless, the primary roles these things served in were as scout aircraft, because if you could get an eye in the sky and you could take a picture of the enemy's trench for potential weak points or where the position of their artillery can be, and that is a huge advantage during this time, because remember, during this time was the First World War, and sometimes they could drop bombs, but mostly they were really used for scouting.
Well,
Now, the way this would work is
the
you would have a pilot that would pilot the aircraft, and then a second man who would actually use the camera and take pictures, because it's not exactly very practical to use a experimental 1900s camera and taking a selfie with it. It's not practical at all.
there were a couple of different versions of what would eventually become the reconnaissance air wings for armies during the First World War. Most of the nations brought out a fair number of aircraft early into the conflict. The primary goal was basically better situational awareness of the battlefield. Um, and they would do this by like basically taking out maps and trying to figure out where troops are and basing it off of maps and reports. Eventually, they would get cameras out onto these aircraft. There was one version where I think you had a camera mounted, basically in the cockpit with a pilot where he could take pictures. Sometimes they would have a rear seater to take pictures or something like that. The bombs did not come about until the second or third years of the war, where crews, in a slow progression of development, started deploying to the battlefield with stuff that they were intending to throw at the ground troops or other aircraft. Uh, stuff like hammers, nails, uh, box of tools, uh, anything hard.
So then
The
someone got the idea. Someone got the idea of, hey, what about explosives?
Well, originally they tried needles.
Oh yeah,
Basically, the story goes that troops were like throwing pens out of airplanes at the enemy troops, and then someone got the bright idea of basically, hey, if we take a box of needles, and when I say a needle, basically like a 2 or 3 inch long metal dart that's about a quarter of an inch thick, a nice pen sized solid metal dart, and then
basically a lawn dart.
basically like chuck it out the side of an aircraft at the ground troops. Um, and then they would escalate to stuff like grenades, mortars, anything that they could really get their hands on. Um,
From there,
and while the attacks on the ground troops were escalating, pilots were also trying to figure out ways to shoot down um, opposing spotting aircraft. And the some of the I've seen accounts of troops throwing stuff at other spotter aircraft or basically trying to ram them, sort of like a in-air duel. That didn't really work well. Uh, so someone got the bright idea of handing out the stuff like pistols to the pilots to shoot at the other spotter aircraft. Well, they couldn't hold a lot of ammunition, but everyone was sort of putting joining together on a central idea of we just need to put guns on airplanes.
and funnily enough, you would have instances there. You'd have instances where pilots were dueling each other with pistols. And actually, the first consignment of 1911s to be issued to troops were actually issued to air reconnaissance guys, so that they could duel the enemy air reconnaissance elements, because it's much easier. It's a much better pistol to have, an 8-shot pistol with that's magazine fed, than a sequential 6 shooter, both in capacity and reload speed. Furthermore, at one point there was a modification for the 1911 that added a brass casing catch cage. So when you fired a round, because if you've served in the military at all, you would know that if you go to the range, the army is very, very stringent about its brass. And if you shoot anything and that they'll weigh it, right? They know exactly how much each casing weighs, or they know how much a casing weighs. So if you bring them back, the empty casings, and there's a certain percentage missing, they will beat you over your skull, because that's how much the army or the military, even to this day, cares about brass. Especially back then, when this is, as far as human history goes, relatively new technology.
Um,
Um, so they
not
would cat.
to,
It would
Although I don't want to give the impression that these pistols were any use for the most part. Most of the shots missed or hit non important parts of biplanes.
right,
So they
and
would basically just punch a hole through and then go out the other side and basically do nothing.
I mean you're at altitude, firing a pistol caliber bullet, or you're just firing a pistol at altitude at high wind speeds, and you're already using a pistol at ranges that practically far exceed it. And but and then finally, for the 1911, for the modification, they added a stendo mag. I'm not even joking. They added an extended mag for the 1911, so they can continue to keep shooting at enemy planes for longer. But eventually, someone got the idea of putting machine guns on planes and putting and aiming them forward, so you could more accurately engage enemy aircraft. One cool feature is that you didn't need to water cool these barrels, because the high amount of air moving across these barrels And also, air has a horrible temperature retention rate, meaning that heat dissipates within air so quickly, very quickly, um, almost immediately, actually. So air coming across the barrels would cool the barrels off pretty quickly, and you wouldn't need to have water cooled barrels because keep in mind, machine gun barrels at this time were essentially rifle barrels that they just put into service, and they would have the issue of overheating constantly, in that they would break because of they were not built to withstand the sheer volume of fire being put through them. So that's why you see those, like the Maxim gun with that giant. Uh, it's a water container, so it cools the barrel, but you simply don't need them in the air because they're moving at such high speeds that the air just cools off the machine gun barrels.
Yeah,
No, it's not exactly.
and the
It's
higher
not
you
exactly
go in
practical,
altitude, the colder it gets.
right? Though it's not exactly practical to just lay on the trigger for like for your entire belt because that leads to other issues, jamming and the
One of the
such.
major issues was jams. Jams were
Mhm.
super prevalent with air mounted machine guns, and there wasn't anything the crews could do about it, except if it was a turreted version and then they had it directly in front of them and outside of any kind of cowling and well within their reach to try to unjam the machine gun, because basically you can't reach up to try to clear a jam, um, which it some of it was caused by the weapons overheating, uh, resulting in the jams, and sometimes it was just random mechanical malfunction, and or belt got uh, caught on something. A round didn't cycle properly, or something broke inside the gun. It's a real hit or miss
Yeah,
for
overall,
guns.
unless you have direct access, unless that machine gun is outside of a housing or not fully enclosed and is within arm's reach, that machine gun's useless. You don't have you that gun's just not going to be useful to you anymore.
Mm. Well,
Um,
like they had stuff where they
and
were putting like machine guns on the basically the top wing. I know on the SEA 5 they had a roof mounted. Think it was a Vickers machine gun. I think, and to shoot it, you basically had to stand up in your seat. It was horrible. Um, but the moment you lose your ability to shoot, uh, a, like it jams, it's it's in reach enough for you to shoot it, but it is not within reach of for you to try to get up and unjam it, unless you do some really fancy flying. Because it's not like these biplanes had autopilot; they varied heavily between extremely crude and uh, standardized, where some of these designs are you are constantly fighting the airframe to keep a level normal airspeed, without the plane trying to torque in a weird direction or the
or
plane
nosedive.
trying to
You're
fly
at the
sideways or do anything strange. So you're
you're trying to keep this plane upright. You are the sole thing that's making this plane fly straight. Because gusts of wind, because with how slow this thing was and how much drag this thing had because of the two wings, you could, if you took your hands off the controls and let them go limp, it would blow your plane off to the side, and it was not a fun thing to do. So as Kento said, you can't. It's not practical to clear a jam unless you can reach the machine gun from sitting down.
or if you can like grab at the action to try to force in the next round, or like pull out the bat messed up link and then try to re-engage the machine gun. I know there were a
Just
couple.
cycle the bad round out.
There were a couple of machine guns where they had basically connectors running to the actions, so you could try to pull them from inside the cockpit. But that wasn't a standard thing for most of these aircraft. Uh, some of these aircraft I can say are fairly well built, like the Albatross in the top right. Most of those were built pretty well. Fokker D7s and the Fokker triplanes usually built pretty good. The Spads were on average like Spad 12s, SCA 5s. They were pretty good aircraft, but there were also some instances where a company would make like 5 aircraft and they were abysmal, and someone would be technically be forced to fly them, or unfortunately be forced to fly them, resulting in very bad times for everyone involved. And no country was immune to the having awful planes, except for America, which just borrowed Britain and France's planes for the most part.
They had the pick of the litter. They went to the best performing ones and say, "Yeah, we'll take those."
It's the same situation with like the FT 17s, where it's
Yeah,
oh wow,
America went over there. Was like, yeah, that thing you built, that's mine now.
can I borrow some of those? That would be really nice.
Can I, by borrow, I mean completely just take them off and create a clone of them. Anyways, so with that said, that's all I have for biplanes.
Um, the the ceiling for these planes was not very high. Uh, Most operations, at least for fighters, was very close to the ground. Flak was prevalent, but it was mostly stuff like machine gun and light artillery that wasn't particularly accurate. They did have auto cannons, which were an absolute menace to these planes because basically you have no armor. There's no way to armor these things, and some of them are basically held together by stitches and seams. Um, and it wouldn't take much for this thing just to fall out of the sky.
And it doesn't help the fact that these things are, how would I say, they're very slow. They're very slow, so they're easy to track.
Yeah, it's there's almost worse than the infantry in World War One have it very rough. There's no two ways around it. It is apocalyptic situations that a lot of troops are put in. But pilots are in about as equally a bad situation. Losses are horrendous. Most troops, at least on the Allied side, are good if they last 4 weeks. Um, it, you're cycling through pilots faster than you can keep them. There's no point to send them to pilot school because they just die. It doesn't matter how if they've been.
It's a waste of training. It's a waste of money at that point.
Well, at least how the commanders saw it. It would have been good if we had more trained pilots, but the commanders couldn't fix the problems with some of these aircraft. Some of these aircraft, the engines would just shut off on the pilots, and they just would basically nosedive into the ground. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean,
regardless, that
these
things would get better as
are balsa wood, leather wrapping, a fuel tank, an engine, you, and a gun. That is it.
Things would get better as we'll see here shortly.
Oh, definitely. We'd be, we'd be in an awful situation if we were still dealing with these standards.
Man. That would. Now we're going to move on to, in the next video, early monoplanes, prop plane primes, and their specialized roles that some prop planes found themselves in. This is because we cut this because YouTube wants to keep our videos within 20 to 30 minutes because of algorithmic reasons, and we're not going to punish you, the viewer, for that because that's, you could say, a mistake on our part. We recorded for too long. With that said, we'll upload these videos back to back one day after each other, not bi-weekly or even weekly. That's just not right. So with that said, have a good one, and now get back to work.